but there was like these different terms that like you would only really understand if you were from Australia. So Glenn felt the need to translate for him.
You got a problem?
Yeah.
Mitch. No.
You treat us like a pack of galahs.
That's a kind of parrot.
Just because I don't wear a tie and I don't spend all day with my head buried in a manual, that doesn't mean I'm a drongo.
That's a hopeless horse.
Yeah, I get the idea, Glenn. Mitch.
Thank you, Ken, for joining. And today we are reviewing the movie that you chose, The Dish.
The Dish indeed, yes. And beautifully attired today with your NASA logoed sweatshirt on there, which I forgot to mention last time. Yes, The Dish, based around the 1969 moon landings and the pivotal role that a dish, a communications dish in the middle of Australia had in relation to bringing the pictures to the world. This film is set in the middle of Australia in this telecommunications dish where it's being used to assist NASA in broadcasting the moon landings. And it's a massive contrast to the last film we reviewed, which was Hidden Figures. Chalk and cheese. Hidden Figures, very serious, very about massive political issues in the States at that particular point. This film, as lighthearted as you can get, it's not a raucous belly laugh type film. It's just a very gentle Australian film, beautifully made, beautifully shot, very low budget. I mean, the budget was, the figures I'm saying are sort of $4 or $5 million. It doesn't specify US or Australian, but that's a peanut budget. It's like, it's absolutely nothing. It's probably the kind of money that one of the stars on a reasonably budgeted American film would get as their wages. So that's the entire budget. It's absolutely nothing. First question, did you enjoy the film?
I did. I absolutely did. I watched it twice and I would definitely watch it again. It was very funny. Keeping with the theme, like you said, it's very different from our last film, but it is the theme of NASA and space, but a different story, broadcasting the moon landing and how this small little town in Australia had a big part in that. Very funny. The lead character, I recognized him and I was like, where did I see him from? And I looked it up and it seems I must have seen him in Jurassic Park.
And you, Cliff, what's your official title?
Cliff Buxton, director.
Or the Dishmaster. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably his most famous role. I mean, in terms of characters, very limited number of characters in this film. We have Ross Mitchell, Mitch. We have Glenn Latham, I think his surname was. We have Al Burnett, and we have Cliff Buxton. Now, Al is from NASA.
Telemetry feeds, can we send those on separate lines? Mitch?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, biomed, TM split feeds.
That's a big book you got there, Al.
So Al has come across to, I'm not going to say supervise, but he's part of the team at the Dish. It Parks, the actual place is called Parks in Australia. So he's come across to be there, to work with the guys at the Dish in terms of the communications, the communications with Apollo 11, and also helping to broadcast these images as man lands on the moon for the first time, hopefully. So yeah, the number of characters is quite limited. There are other characters which pop up in the film. We have Bob McIntyre, who is the mayor of Parks, and he is the person who was instrumental in getting the Dish built.
And actually mention who got the dish here.
Oh, come on, love.
You've never got due credit, Robert McIntyre.
Oh, I've done all right, Maisie.
Then we have other sort of characters dotted around the film, but our main protagonists are Mitch, as he's referred to as. We have Glenn, Al, and Cliff. Now, Mitch has a slight issue with NASA and with Al in particular. He thinks he's overbearing. He thinks that he believes that the guys don't know what they're doing. And there's conflict in a very soft and very gentle way. There's no shouting and throwing things around and massive tantrums. There's one little occasion where there's a slight bit of tension, but basically it's, this tension between the two of them in particular is what builds this story. So it's about how this conflict is resolved over time, and the way the story is kind of based over just a few days leading up to the moon landings, and the final preparations. The film is beautifully edited. It's beautiful, like I said, it's beautifully shot and beautifully edited, using a lot of original either NASA footage or news footage of the time. So they intercut quite beautifully all of these old images of people lining the streets, people waiting to watch the launch, the politicians, the news stories of the day. This is all cut together to generate the image of this particular period of time, which, like I say, is 3, 4, 5 days. It's a very short period of time. It involves, again, there are several of the characters who kind of come in just to build the color of the film. So you've got the American ambassador, who comes across as a lovely guy. His name escapes me at the moment, but he's just...
Mr. Ambassador, on behalf of the people of Parks, we welcome you to Parks.
Why, thank you, Bob. I can call you Bob.
Absolutely, Mr. Ambassador.
Howard.
I think he's the kind of ambassador you want to represent your country. He just comes across as really sweet and very pleasant, and seems to get on very well with Bob McIntyre and Bob McIntyre's wife. Bob McIntyre's small son, who must be 7 or 8, is very up on the moon landings. He's very up on what's going to be happening, to the point where he's actually telling his dad, the mayor, how things are going to be going, what the terminology is.
Command and service module until they reach the moon. And the rockets aren't even on.
Really?
And they just sit and wait.
Is that right?
Yeah, and this is the fastest man's ever travelled.
Go on.
His son is very much at the leading edge of seeing man landing on the moon, and just seeing what I think Bob's little son is so up on the terminology, on what's happening. He's obviously just absorbing all of this information. I mean, it was a worldwide event, absolute worldwide event. I remember myself watching the moon landings. We all gathered around the TV. I mean, even in the late 60s in the UK, having a TV was not a given. So people, there's still people who didn't have TVs. So I remember neighbours coming round to watch our TV, because we had a TV, because my father at that particular point was repairing televisions, because at that particular point, you rented a television. You didn't buy one, you rented a TV. Well, certainly in the UK, you rented a TV. So he was in the business of repairing and maintaining television. So we always had TV. So we had neighbours around to watch the moon landings. I mean, that's how big it was, that, neighbours would come around just to watch the moon landing. It was just the most incredible thing to be part of. And we're not Americans, so, but everybody, I think, knew just how big this was, how big an event this was.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't there for it, but one thing we were mentioning earlier, and I wanted to point out, when you mentioned this tension between Al and Glenn, for we picked this, or you picked this movie. I think part of the theme was the NASA theme, but also part was the Australian kind of accent. But Glenn was translating, he would use these terms to kind of insult Al, and then Glenn was translating it, and then Al said, "I don't need you to translate. I can tell from the tone." But there was these different terms that you would only really understand if you were from Australia. So Glenn felt the need to translate for him.
You got a problem?
Yeah.
Mitch, no?
You treat us like a pack of galahs.
That's a kind of parrot.
Just because I don't wear a tie and I don't spend all day with my head buried in a manual, that doesn't mean I'm a drongo.
That's a hopeless horse.
Yeah, I get the idea, Glenn. Mitch.
Because we were coming off the back of Hidden Figures, and this is a film about NASA, and it's an Australian film, I chose it not because the Australian accents are particularly strong. They're not actually. It's very toned down. It's very mellow. But I thought it would be interesting to see a different perspective, and also, from a country which has not got a massive history of blockbuster films, but does actually make some absolute cracking little films on very small budgets. But yes, I mean, there is this couple of sequences, one in particular, where Glenn is having to translate Australian expressions to Al, and you're right. I mean, Al kind of gets it, because it says it's all about the tone. Glenn's the geek. Glenn's the funny one. He's his flash to bang. His flash to bang. So that's a military expression, which means when you see the flash and you hear the bang, it's the distance between the speed of light and the speed of sound. So he's told jokes, or they have a TV crew around, and I think Mitch makes some reference to carrier pigeons carrying the signal back. And about 3 seconds later, Glenn starts laughing because his ability to deal with things is just, his flash to bang is just too slow. He's definitely the geek. He's definitely the person who's got, he's got a slight inability to deal with things and people. And he has this young girl from the village who's very keen on him. And he's just totally incapable of asking her out for a date.
Imagine the Earth is basketball.
This'll be good.
And on top of the basketball is, what's the thing you put the pump into?
The hole.
Yeah, but it's got a name. Oh, the valve. Well, let's say the valve is Goldstone, and on the other side is another valve.
Now, basketballs only have one valve.
Being aware or dealing with her, communicating with her. And that's one of the other sort of subplots in the film. It's kind of touched upon, it's brought in, it's just a way of, I think, of padding out Glenn as a character. And I think most of these things they're just a way of padding out and giving a little bit more depth to these characters. With a lot of films like this, there's only so much you can do in 90 minutes. And even with a small number of main protagonists, you need to have some ideas to who these people are, what their backstory is, how they work within the film. I mean, their character is part of, and Glenn is definitely the mathematician. He's the guy who's in charge of the computer and getting everything together. And we see him when something's gone wrong, having to try and mathematically work out how to resolve the issue. So Glenn has this admirer, I think she's called Janine. You can see his total inability to, one, deal with her, and two, with other people, deal with them. He's very introvert. He's very, very introvert. And there's another kind of slightly odd character, the dishes security guard, who I think is actually Janine's brother.
It is.
Yes. He's kind of thrown in there, and you kind of wonder why, because he doesn't really have this massive role, but he brings pieces of the story together very gently, yet he's not really developed as a character. He's given a gun, which must have been, because he said it's a NASA requirement because we're part of NASA, and he has to guard the dish. This dish is in the middle of absolutely nowhere.
And he
it's
says,
surrounded by...
Don't tell Mom because she'll probably take it away.
Visitor offering resistance.
You've got a gun.
Nah. Official NASA requirement. Armed security.
Does Mum know?
No. And don't you tell her either, Janine.
Yeah, I mean, he's probably the kind of guy you would not really want to give a gun to because he's completely incapable. There are a couple of other characters who drop in and out of this film. There is a young chap who is in military dress. He's a military cadet, and he is desperately trying to court the daughter of the mayor. Again, it's kind of slightly random. It just adds to the color of the film. It just adds to the slightly idiosyncratic nature of a lot of these people within this film. It is a way of linking things at time, and they are part of this very gentle humor which runs through the film. I mean, he's desperately trying to impress her, and he's swirling this gun, and she's looking out the window.
Morning, Marie.
And she's just not impressed because politically, she must only be 17 or 18. Politically, her brain is completely different to his. She's very radical. She sees everybody as, I think she sees the American ambassador as fascist, and just,
and the moon landing as like a chauvinistic, display.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, there are, and the other sort of odd character who pops up now and again is Bob McIntyre's wife, who I didn't actually catch her name. She's very lovely. They're a very loving couple, and you can see that kind of running through. She's very much in support of him and what he's been doing. There's this big kind of sequence where the American ambassador comes to Parks. So he's come to visit the establishment. He's come to visit the dish and give support, and obviously it's a big kind of occasion, well out of the usual for these people in this very small town. I mean, you know, they're not used to meeting ambassadors and people of importance, so they're slightly overawed by this guy, by the ambassador. And there's this lovely sequence where they're all sort of prepping to meet the ambassador, and the ambassador's big, massive Cadillac turns up, and they just bend over and just wave at the ambassador. It's like, you know, like, yeah, okay. Just a charming little shot, just full of very soft humor. Yeah, I just one of those things where I just thought, yeah, I really like the way they've played this for soft, gentle laughs. I mean, for you, coming back to this, having seen this for the first time, I mean, what were your impressions of these characters? What were your impressions of the portrayal of Al as the American, and of the other characters? I mean, give me your overview of this.
I liked how there was the tension between Al and Mitch and how they started to resolve, because there was a whole thing where the whole town lost power, and when the whole town lost power, so did the dish. And when the dish lost power, the computer lost all its data because Mitch did not prime the pump of the generator. Apparently, generator didn't kick on, and so Cliff decided they lost the coordinates of where the Apollo spaceship was, right? So they lost it. They didn't know where it was. And they didn't want to let NASA know that because they were afraid that they didn't want to say, we've lost it, and could you please give it to us? Because NASA knew that, because they were afraid that NASA would say, you know what, you're not going to do the moon landing. We're not going to let you do that because you're screwed up. So Cliff, the lead character, decided to kind of like fib a little bit while they figured out the math. Al was a bit upset, but he went along with it, and he actually like went along, and they did a whole thing where they kind of, the ambassador also showed up at that point, and the ambassador wanted to listen in on this, on the Houston, and the talk back and forth to the Apollo spacecraft.
So you'll be getting transmissions?
Yeah,
You'll be able to hear Armstrong talking to Houston?
just by hitting a couple of buttons there.
Oh, let's do that.
Al and I believe Mitch went up on top of the dish and were using their walkie-talkie radios to ad-lib a little communication between Neil Armstrong and Mission Control. So they kind of like, and so the ambassador thinks he's listening. He's like, wow, it's so clear. It sounds like it's next door. And it was.
Columbia, Houston, guidance systems okay. You're still go for oil.
Copy that.
Neill, telemetry reports that O2 and CO2 are okay and steady.
And biomed telemetry is now reading your
Vital statistics as being adequate within the limits.
And it was the brother that almost kind of like gave it away, because he's like, what's going on the radios? But they ended up like ad-libbing it. And then later on, I was like, you know what, at NASA we make mistakes all the time. And he's like, he made some mention about a small town person that wasn't the best in his class that is going to be like to do something super amazing. And it ended up being Neil Armstrong that he was talking about. He's like, I'm most impressed. Like, he was like some small town person that wasn't, you know, the top of his class. Like, yeah, there are people that are from all the top universities. There are also normal people, and we make mistakes all the time. So we're just as real. We're just like we make mistakes all the time. And we just like, we work it out.
I mean, sort of coming back to that, there is a situation, as you say, where the town has a power cut. They lose all the information on the computer. And I think it's this particular point, as you say, where basically Al backs them up and says, everything's fine here. We don't know what the problem is. Let's resolve it. But at that particular point, it kind of goes from this conflict of the Americans and the Australians, the small boys and the big boys. They suddenly become a team. They're lying together. They're basically fooling the world that everything's fine. So it's gone from a conflict to a bunch of guys trying to resolve the problem of one, finding Apollo 11, which actually proves to be really simple. And actually, it's like, there's a moon, and that's where Apollo 11 is going to be. So we're not scanning the whole, solar system, point it at the moon, point the dish at the moon, and we will eventually find Apollo 11.
It's on its way to the moon. That's your point of reference. They've gone 150,000 miles. They've got to be within 3-4 degrees.
Which is what they do. I mean, we're talking about Mitch, we're talking about Glenn, we're talking about Al and Cliff, and we're talking about sort of Bob and a lot of the other characters in the film. There is one character which we haven't talked about. Really, we haven't named the character. Oh, we have, but we haven't. It is the dish. It is the dish. It is the star. I mean, it's massive. And there's some beautiful shots of the dish. And also the dish is not a prop. When they filmed this film, they actually had to use the dish. So they had to turn it off. Again, just reading through some of the reports and some of the sort of news pieces and what have you on the internet, they had to switch it off. So rather than tracking the stars, they switched it off to allow the film crew to film on the dish. So there's a lovely sequence where they're playing cricket. It's in the dish.
Still not.
There's the sequence where Glenn kind of comes up with cups of tea. There's lots of cups of tea in this film, tea everywhere. The whole film is swimming in tea. If there's a problem, they sound really British. I mean, the Australians, they probably criticize me, but they have closer culture in some respects to us than, say, the Americans. Tea. If there's a problem, cup of tea, that'll solve the problem. It'll certainly give us breathing time. But yeah, there's shots of sort of Glenn coming out of this little sort of this hatch into the dish with cups of, yeah. So, but yeah, some beautiful shots of the dish and sort of little, I'm going to say little music sequences where the dish is doing things and you can see the moon and the dish crosses in front of the moon. Again, it's a non-talking star of this film. It is the dish in itself. It's actually somewhere I'd love to go and visit because it looks amazing. This thing the dish in Australia looks absolutely amazingly impressive. But yeah, I mean, they go from being at war with each other to becoming really good kind of colleagues in terms of trying to resolve this problem and not letting NASA know there's an issue. And you're right. I mean, they could have quite easily rung up NASA and said, could you give us the coordinates? But they didn't want to lose face. It's their point in their villages or their towns, their cities' history, where they are pivotal, absolutely pivotal at getting the signals from the moon to the world. There's a little bit, again, going back to what I've been reading on the internet, there's a little bit of, although it's based on a true story, let's say there are liberties taken as to things which happened. It's kind of, yeah, they've used Parkes as the pivotal place, but in fact there are other satellite stations around who were instrumental in broadcasting the signals to the world. But hey, why let the truth get in the way of a good story?
I think it's similar, like of our last movie, where there was the use of the whole story of Katherine Johnson running to the bathroom and having to go a half mile or a mile away to go to the bathroom, which actually, when you read up on it, she just used the whites only bathroom. So it made interesting, and they add some comic relief to it. And so to make a 2-hour movie about something, they got to kind of, maybe add a little bit more to the story, add some comic relief, add some other characters. I mean, that's going to make it interesting to people watching it.
I mean, this goes back to The King's Speech and a couple of other of those films we've reviewed, which are based on real events. The script writers weren't there. They happened to put something together which makes a film very enjoyable to watch. So yeah, you take a bit of that place and a bit of that place and a bit of that character, and you create this one place and you create this one character to bring you through and to lead you through the storyline. So I think that's fairly common, especially when you've got a budget which is so small. You're really having to be creative as to how you use your money and how much you can get out of your budget and how much you can create just a really good product. And this is just a really good product. I mean, it's from the year 2000. It looked beautiful. I mean, it hasn't aged in 20 odd years. It looked lovely. Really nice, solid acting throughout. I really empathize with a lot of the characters. I just love the bit parts as well. They just added flavor, they added content to the film. So yeah, I mean, you have to do that in the film. You cannot not follow either a book to the letter or a historical event to the letter, because it will just be boring as hell, because you have to condense time, you have to condense facts and figures to create something which will make an hour and a half, 2-hour film enjoyable to watch, so that the audience leaves the cinema or walks away from the TV and thinks, wow, that was great, I thoroughly enjoyed that, rather than sitting there going, I want to switch this off because it's boring.
Exactly, to your point, that they add those, like you mentioned, the characters, the daughter, the cadet, which I think here we'd call it ROTC member, the brother being the security guard, adding all that to kind of really make that into an interesting story.
Yeah, there's a bit where the security guard, the brother, whose name I've absolutely forgotten, he brings up some sandwiches and he says, because he's the security guard, says, I've had to taste them just to make sure they're all right and they're not poisoned. They've come from his mum. Right. His mother brought. It's like, yes, his mother is going to poison everybody. just little bits like that, which just, and I think you've got to, even though it's a very simple film, you've got to kind of follow these people. You've got to follow these characters to understand the links. If you just wash over it, you'll lose all of these little links. There's a lot of information in there. It's just kind of dropped in. So yeah, that food came from his mum.
Right. Like he's taking himself a little too serious.
Very much so. There's this beautiful little scene where both Cliff and Al stand in the dish for it to be turned up, simply because the dish is in a position where they can't access it through the hatch. So both Al and Cliff sit on the stairway, which is within the dish, and they have this chat. And as the dish moves up and they're chatting, you can actually see the horizon. You can see the trees moving at the same time. Now, I've done Jodrell Bank, which is a big dish in the UK, sort of installation in the UK. And these things, they do not move fast. They're a very slow movement. So for the guys to shoot that must have taken a long period of time to get it right, to get the lines right, to get the angles right, and a very difficult location because it is a dish. They would have had to have turned the dish off or stopped using the dish in terms of scanning the sky, listening and watching for things happening out in space. So, I mean, all credit to the dish and the owners, the runners, the people who managed the dish, for allowing the camera crew, for allowing the film crew to do that. That must have been incredibly difficult for them, because that would have probably taken a couple of days to film that sequence again and again, because you'd have to drop it back down, bring it up again, down, up, down. That's a lot of work. And there would have been a lot of people within the dish working to get those scenes. So, you can see how much they saved in terms of budget by using the actual location. If they'd had to build the dish and build those locations, that would have been frighteningly expensive, which I think is how they keep costs down, by shooting on location. There are a couple of little sequences where you see the mechanism of the dish working, and it kind of the cogs helping to move the dish and the pistons. So yeah, I mean, for me, the attention to detail, and there's a lot of attention to detail, is just watching Cliff and Al chatting, and you just see the trees slowly leaving frame as the dish is moving up.
Yeah, I especially liked those close-ups of the cogs and the gears to see how that dish moved, because I had no idea. And speaking of the dish, and we had the power outage that caused some problems, they also had a storm. The reason they were using this dish, and this dish was located where it was there was hardly ever any wind or any kind of weather issues there. But then all of a sudden, right before they're going to air broadcast the moon landing, all of a sudden the wind started picking up, and they are not supposed to move that dish when it's over 30 knots per hour, I believe. And the wind started to get up to at least 60 knots per hour, which I think is 100 kilometers and 60 miles an hour. It was, the wind was like picking up. And so they were needing to decide, are we going to broadcast the moon landing or are we not going to broadcast it?
What? Wind.
Glenn's onto the bureau.
It's a blowing.
15 knots.
And we're rated to...
30.
So we're fine.
For now.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, again, another piece of drama is to add the wind and you know, the effects on a 100-ton dish. I think they quote the dish is 100 tons, and it really just becomes one big sail. So when you've got winds of, I think initially they were quoting knots. Later it was quoting in miles per hour, so 60 miles per hour winds, which equates to roughly 100 kilometers per hour. Obviously, those kinds of winds on a huge dish, incredibly dangerous. So normally they drop that to give it as little resistance to the wind as possible. So yes, it's a way of adding drama, and obviously they all kind of agree that these are extra special times. We've got to take chances. Because they talk about the fact that they're looking at the danger to themselves if that 100-ton dish is grabbed by the wind and it rips it apart. They would all die. But they take this decision in the control center to go with it. It's special times, which really call for the decision to go ahead and broadcast man landing on the moon. Because they had talked about, prior to that, they had talked about the fact that getting the TV pictures was important, but actually getting the men off the moon
was the most important.
Was even more important. TV pictures are great, but just getting TV pictures for the sake of TV pictures, when in fact, men's lives were at risk. This had never been done. We talked about this in Hidden Figures. This was all uncharted territory. Getting a man on the moon and getting a man off the moon safely was the biggest thing. So the TV pictures were just the cream on the cake. That was something special. That was like, yeah, getting man on the moon, getting man off the moon was much more important. The pictures, great, because it just shows the world what was happening. But yeah, adding extra drama with the storm which brewed up around the dish, an area, as you said, which had sort of been chosen because of its fairly constant, calm climatic conditions. On the day, obviously, it changed slightly with this massive storm which came in.
Thank you so much for suggesting it. I like going along with the theme, and I fully enjoyed this movie. Would definitely watch it again for sure.
So The Dish seems to be a film you'd quite happily recommend to people.
Absolutely. I enjoyed watching it, watched it twice for this review, and I would absolutely watch it again and recommend it to people. Very enjoyable. It has a lot of comical points to it, but also tells a different story about NASA, a different story about moon landing from an Australian point of view.
So if we leave this film, if we leave The Dish behind, what are we going to follow it up with? What's the next film?
I figured we'd do something completely different, and we'd go back in time into the archives and watch the movie Harvey.
Oh my God, that's going back a few years. That's got to be a post-war film. James Stewart, if I remember rightly.
Yes. I watched that first when I think I was like 6 years old when I watched that movie.
Oh yeah. I do recall it being a really lovely, soft, gentle comedy. Yeah, haven't got it in my collection, so it's going to have to be eBay. Find myself a second-hand copy of Harvey. Thank you very much. Looking forward to that, and thank you very much for your comments on The Dish.
All right, thank you.